Hi, everyone. This is Professor Hall, and welcome to Literature for Children and Young Adults. So, today I just want to give you a quick overview about reading and child development. And what I'm going to do today is talk about all of the categories of books that we'll be looking at throughout the semester, and a little bit about who those books are for in terms of audience, what age they're for, the length, and some of the things that we typically see. Then later on in the semester, I'll have a longer lecture about each one of these types. And we'll also talk a little bit today about what our class is going to do and what our class is not going to do. So let's get started. So we're going to be beginning with chapter books. Those are books for children, usually in kindergarten to second grade. We'll be looking at fiction for each stage of childhood and young adulthood. And I will talk about what those books are and what they're called in just a moment. What this class is not going to do is look at books for younger children, birth up until kindergarten. So that class is taught at our school as well. If you are an early childhood major or an education major, I highly recommend taking it. It really looks at how young children learn to read and write, what their developmental needs are for younger children, and how you can play a part in that development. Instead, for us, what we're going to do is focus on three primary areas: cognitive, emotional, and social development for children, tweens, and teens. So our first unit is going to look at children ages 5 to 7. That's with chapter books. Then we're going to move on to middle grade books for children 8 to 10, and then for tweens ages 10 to 13. And then we'll finish the course with young adult books. That's books for teenagers ages 13 to 18. We'll talk a tiny bit about new adult books, which are intended for people over the age of 18 when they're first starting college or their career. And in each unit, we'll talk about the needs of readers in each of these groups and examine how the books assigned this semester reflect the developmental changes that kids those ages are going through and how they meet the emotional, social, or intellectual needs of the readers. In our discussion, we'll also talk about literary elements such as plot, characterization, point of view, theme, motif, which are repeated elements, and symbolism. You'll find a lot of this type of discussion a lot more in the books for older kids. Typically, in books for younger children, we don't have some of these elements are not as prominent because younger kids can't understand symbolism as much. They don't really think symbolically, and the plots are sometimes a little bit more straightforward. But for each book, sometimes for pairs of books, I'll have a separate lecture where we'll talk about the emotional and social and cognitive development of the characters in those books, and again, how those books meet the needs of the readers that in that same age group. So one of the things I want you to keep in mind as we have these discussions is that development is really a continuum. You can kind of see, there we go, the Hobbit running up the hill there. I'm going to get rid of him. Sorry, it's a little too distracting. The guy there on the left, climbing those steps. So moving from trust and mistrust, which is very young child learning to trust their parents, into this realm of teenage life where there's role confusion and they're trying to figure out their identity. If you think about like a third grade classroom, in a third grade classroom, you might have some people, some of the students who are not quite as developed in their reading skills. They might be reluctant readers where they just don't really enjoy reading, or they really struggle with reading for one reason or another. So you might have somebody in that situation who's still reading at like a first grade level. Then you might also have kids in the same class who love reading. It's really enjoyable for them, and they read up, meaning they want to read about kids older than them. So they're already like into books for maybe 5th or 6th grade. So when we talk about these developmental milestones, we're going to look in the books that we read about ways in which the characters might be right on target for their age. They're meeting those developmental steps. Other times we'll talk about how maybe you can see them trying to go through a step, or one way in which they kind of haven't met it yet. But the important thing to know is that really a developmental milestone is a guideline. It's nothing set in stone. So it's just something to keep in mind as we go. There we go. And as we run up our hill. Similarly, the needs of readers, there we go, also fall on a continuum. These are the basic categories of books that have been set forth by publishers in the past couple of years. So before these developments, children's literature was kind of all lumped together into one big group. And in the 1960s and 70s, you had a lot of people challenging books or trying to ban books. And I think part of the reason is, you have a book, say, by Judy Blume about a girl going through puberty, and it's on a shelf next to a picture book, two totally different, or at least in the same room, right? So it's two totally different age groups. One is more appropriate for somebody maybe 14, 15, the other more for somebody 6 or 7. In the 1980s, you start to see a little bit more development in YA, young adult literature. And as publishing has kind of grown, especially with digital publishing and print on demand, and our understanding of children's development has grown. The needs of readers and marketing's changed a lot too, to be honest with you. So because of that, we now have all of these different types of children's literature. So the first is board books. Those are the ones made out of a heavy cardboard, sometimes plastic, for babies to chew on. Usually those are going to be less than 100 words. They're really for young readers, for mom and dad or for a teacher to read along with the child. A primer is something that's used in school a lot. You also have alphabet books, so things that are meant to help teach children how to read. Those are kind of used at the same time as picture books, and oftentimes a primer is a picture book. Picture books, again, on a continuum, they can be for kids who are 2 or 3, all the way up to kids who are 8. So there are books that are meant for older children. A lot of times those will have really intricate artwork. They'll be longer than a standard picture book, that kind of thing. And then we have chapter books, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But I wanted to spend a little bit more time on the first 3 just to explain we're not going to cover those in this class. And firstly, because they are covered in emerging literacy in quite a lot of detail. But secondly, just because this is an online class for practical purposes, I decided to cut those out this semester and just jump right into chapter books. It's very difficult to talk about picture books in an online environment. So chapter books are for kids who are kindergarten, 1st, 2nd grade. We'll talk about those in a moment. Then we have lower middle grade, which is 3rd through 5th grade. Upper middle grade, which is your middle school years. Young adult, which is high school. And then new adult, which is just after high school. And we'll talk about each one of those now in a little bit more detail. So chapter books. The standard text for a picture book is 32 pages and about 1,000 words. An easy reader is different. An easy reader looks like a regular book. So 5x8 or 6x9, those are standard paperback book sizes. An easy reader usually has several hundred words, and it's meant for children to read on their own. So there's a couple easy readers that are made from Dr. Seuss books. There's some Berenstein Bear books. There are a couple publishers that have what's called I Can Read books, where very simple sentences. Sister Bear saw her friend. She went over to her friend, right? That kind of thing. Again, for kids to kind of learn to read on their own. So chapter books, same setup. They look like a novel. And if you've bought your books already, you know that. Chapter books are usually 48 to 64 pages. Sometimes they can be a tad bit longer. They're always going to be less than 100 pages. And I really want to be clear, and I want you to know this term, because in the general let me try that again. In the general population, in the world, people misuse this term a lot. Chapter books used to mean something quite different. So if you hear people talking about a chapter book and they're really talking about a novel for kids, it's because we had a different understanding of a chapter book many years ago. But now, chapter books are typically around 5,000 to 10,000 words. And sometimes for younger kids, so like the books that we're reading are really, if you were in kindergarten, you would have a teacher or a parent read it to you, and you might be able to follow along with those words. And if you were in first, maybe second, and definitely, hopefully by second grade, you'd be reading it on your own. So some of chapter books are meant to be read along with a child or read to a child. Other children are advanced enough, again, that continuum, right, to read them on their own. There may also be some reluctant readers, so kids who are maybe in third grade who are still drawn to chapter books. This could be too, just because they liked the characters when they were younger. That's pretty common. You know, they kind of want to hang on to that for a little bit. Chapter books are called chapter books because they have very short chapters. So unlike a picture book, which is one story told through the whole book, these are sometimes going to be episodes. We're going to use that term episodic quite a bit, meaning that each short chapter has kind of a beginning, middle, and end, where there's a problem, there's a complication, there's a resolution. Sometimes, because the chapters are so short, the whole story comes together by the end. So it might be an entire story told over the course of the book. But a very straightforward storyline, no flash forwards, flashbacks, anything like that. Pretty simple characterization typically, and definitely illustrations. And not as many, obviously, as a picture book, but on almost every page you're going to have an illustration, or on every spread. That's when we look at 2 pages together. So here are some examples. Junie B. Jones, we're going to be reading. Dinosaur Detectives, that's one of the Magic School Bus books. Princess in Black, Shannon and Dean Hale, Nate the Great. All of these are great examples of picture books. So if you like Junie B. Jones and you want some books that are similar to that, if you're thinking about teaching or if you have kids, I highly recommend all these series. And the series is kind of important too. Most chapter books are part of a series because if kids like one, they want more. So a lot of authors can take good advantage of that. Lower middle grade books is our next step up. These are books intended for readers grades 3 to 5. And you'll notice that the length has increased. So 15,000 to about 30,000 words. Again, you can see by the kids who are reading here, typical standard paperback size. All of our books from this point on will be lighter subject materials, so there's not going to be any mention of violence. There's no drug use or alcohol use. There's no swearing. There's no sex or romantic elements. I mean, obviously no sex, right? But sometimes I've had people who write for children or who want to write for children, and they'll ask me about, what content can they have in there, particularly if they're talking about something historical. So you might think, obviously no violence, right? But if you want to have a book for this age range that maybe depicts something in World War II, how do you go about doing that? And the answer is typically you don't. You make it for a little bit of an older crowd. But these books still have a pretty simple plot. So as you read, look for that. Look for one plot line through the whole book. No, Again, no major flashbacks, flash forwards, no. Typically, you have one narrator, so a character narrating the story or a third person voice narrating the story. You're not going to have here multiple points of view. Many times the plots are episodic, and the two books that I have chosen for you have an episodic plot. So that is, and again, another word I'd like you to kind of remember. There we go. That means that each chapter has a beginning, middle, and end. When we look at something like the Mrs. Pigglewiggle book, there is a different child featured in each chapter. So in the Pippi book, there's 3 children having adventures together. Each chapter is a separate adventure. In terms of language, these books have interesting plots, fun characterization, but still simple sentences, and a little bit more vocabulary. It's a age range, grades 3 to 5, where kids really start to stretch their vocabulary. So that's something to look for as well. Readers in this developmental stage, the protagonists are like the readers. They're concerned with things like friendships, family, relationships, school, sports, forming basic bonds. Parents and mentors are going to play a significant role in the protagonist's story. This is very similar to chapter books. So in terms of subject matter, the difference between chapter books and lower middle grade, there's not too much of a difference usually. Sometimes with lower middle grade, we'll see some genre fiction, so fantasy and mysteries and things like that. But a lot of the time, the subject matter really isn't too much different. You can think about kids that age, between 2nd grade and 4th grade. They're concerned a lot with some similar stuff. Parents and teachers are making the decisions regarding book choices. So sometimes kids of this age, if they're taken into a library, they'll pick out a book that they might enjoy or that they think they might like. But they're still guided a lot by their parents and teachers. And the book choices have been sort of curated, right, by a librarian. They're not buying books on their own or making that kind of decision. So here are some examples. The Pippi series and the Mrs. Pigglewiggle series, which I said we're going to be looking at. Ivy and Bean is interesting because it's almost between a chapter book and a lower middle grade. It's really that 2nd, 3rd grade level. Lots of pictures, whereas Mrs. Pigglewiggle will have a few pictures throughout the chapter. They're not necessarily on every single page. A Whole New Ball Game is a great book for reluctant readers and features 2 kids playing basketball. There's also some issues of disability in there that I think are great to have kids relate to if they're going through some stuff like that, and also to increase empathy. So upper middle grade, our next step up. We see some middle school kids here reading. These books are intended for middle schoolers, so grades 6 through 8. Again, our word count increases. You might see a little bit longer books. A lot of people point to Harry Potter. Harry Potter is a fantasy series. It starts in upper middle grade and it goes all the way through upper young adult. So it's not unusual for it's called a crossover series, which we'll talk about later. It's not unusual for a crossover series like that to be a little bit longer, especially when in fantasy because there's world building. Upper middle grade books change in terms of subject matter. So they're not all dark. You can still have lighter and fun subjects. But the books that I've chosen for you are a little bit darker just to kind of show those changes in development. There's not necessarily swearing in these books because authors still want them to be taught in school. But there could be issues of violence. Drug and alcohol use may occur, but it usually happens off page. So the protagonist maybe sees things going on, hears about things going on. They probably at this point would not be directly involved in it. So let's say you have a girl whose older sister has to take her to a party and she sees somebody drinking there, right? As opposed to a young adult book where the older sister would be the protagonist and she's drinking while her younger sister is there. That's sort of the difference there. No sex in these books. They might have some light romantic elements. So holding hands, first crushes, first kisses, that kind of thing. not unusual to have. Now, I will say that even with those, sometimes teachers are hesitant to have books that include that in their classroom because they really don't want to have to discuss it with the students. The plot is going to be longer. We're not going to see as much episodic plot here as we are a complex plot that runs the entirety of the novel, reflecting some of those cognitive changes that middle schoolers are going through. A subplot, maybe two, complexity of language, multiple points of view. You might have multiple first-person narrator with a different person telling each chapter of the story. Like readers at this developmental age, protagonists are going to be a lot more concerned with friendships, peer relationships, acceptance versus rejection. Parents and family are still important, so they're not completely out of the picture yet. And a lot of the times, books for this age range move the protagonist from childhood to adolescence. So that is a major thing to look for. So here are some examples. Wonder does have multiple narrators telling the story. Joey Pigza, we're going to read that, so you'll hear more about that later. Escape from Aleppo is about a girl who is living in a war-torn country and has to escape. So some of the violence that happens around her, she knows about, but we don't see in like a gory way, I guess, if that makes sense. And Drama is a graphic novel. This girl here in the middle, she has a crush on this boy, and this boy also has a crush on him. So a little bit of a controversial book, but really, you know, it's intended for 8th graders. And I think because it's a graphic novel, it's often, and kind of a cartoonish looking graphic novel, it's often picked up by kids in 3rd or 4th grade. So again, you know, knowing those developmental differences when you're choosing books can be really important. Now we come to young adult. So readers grades 9 to 12, teenagers 13 to 18. Sometimes you can get up into 80,000 words, 60 to 80,000 words. I picked a shorter book for you guys, and then I picked a graphic novel. So especially because of our time frame, we didn't have time to read really a longer book. Young adult books may be a bit darker than middle grade. A lot of times, dark plot lines or themes kind of reflect the angst that teens are going through at this age. They typically, though, have more optimistic endings than adult books. So if you think of something like The Hunger Games, it's violent, there are dark themes, but in general, people are okay at the end, right? With a book like a dystopian book for adults might not have such a positive ending. And a lot of times dystopian books for adults are kind of left up in the air, like the society still is horrible. Nothing's been really changed except maybe the person going through the changes. Swearing, alcohol, drug use, and violence may occur on the page. Romance and sex also may be on the page. They're usually, though, not described in detail. Now, I will say, with the exception of some books that started out on Wattpad, I have seen those, The Kissing Booth, if you've seen that Netflix movie, it started out as a book on Wattpad, which is like an open source thing for authors to put things on. It's a teen girl who's writing, who probably has not experienced what she's writing about. But even if it has a tiny bit of detail, if sex occurs, it's going to be an important plot point. So an assault, as in the book Speak, a character's first time, like the book The Kissing Booth. Complex plots, subplots, and inconsistent or unreliable narration. We'll talk a little bit more later about what that means. Like readers at this developmental stage, protagonists are very concerned with identity, who they are, who they might become. And mostly we're not going to see parents and mentors. The books that I chose for you, the families are there, kind of. I mean, they're mentioned, but they're not as much, I don't think, major characters in the story. The protagonist is going through these changes. If the parents are there, they're still kind of going through the changes alone. A lot of times in fantasy books, the parents are killed off in the beginning. If you think about Harry Potter, his parents are dead, right, in the middle grade book, and then he has other mentors who die as he becomes older, sort of symbolically showing his transition into adulthood. At this point, some reading is still dictated by teachers. I picked this picture of all these kids reading Fahrenheit 451 for school, but young adults do have some purchasing power. So if a teen really likes books, they will buy them, a lot of times electronically. And here are some examples. By book 3 in Harry Potter, we're right smack in YA. Fault in Our Stars by John Green. Again, there are some heavier themes there dealing with cancer and tragedy, and there is some sex there as well, not to spoil it for you guys. Hunger Games, as I mentioned, violence. Life of Pi is interesting because it's actually a book for adults, but it features a teenage protagonist. So in some ways, it's kind of a young adult book. It's, again, a crossover book, meaning it can be for adults or for teens. And lastly, new adult. We're going to talk about this a tiny bit when we look at Persepolis. New adult books are intended for readers who are 18 to 25 years old. So in that first stage, just after high school. Usually they're about the same length as young adult books. So about 60,000 to 80,000 words. They can be longer, but most of the time these are contemporary novels. So they're not longer than that. They can be more darker and more pessimistic than young adult books. Again, swearing, alcohol, drug use, romance, sex. As with adult literature, there might be a little bit more detail in the sex scenes. It's not always an important plot point like it would be with young adult books. But the complexity of the relationship, the formation of identity, the disappearance of role confusion, pushing your way through the world in college or in a career or with your first long-term sort of real relationship, right? Those are typical themes. So a lot of the plotting is like young adult literature or adult literature, but the subject matter is different and the age of the protagonist is different. And what publishers are really trying to do here is capture young adult readers to get them to stop reading just YA. What they found about 5 years ago is that you had people who were 18, 19, 20, 25 still reading young adult books because they enjoyed them so much. And so a lot of authors said, hey, why don't we make books that are for this age group specifically? So sometimes people in this age group might read new adult books. Sometimes they might still read YA just because a lot of times those are more imaginative and a little bit more unique. And other times they'll be fully in adult books and they just, they're ready for that. There's nothing wrong with any of those. Typically here, parents not present at all, mentors really not, unless it's somebody, a professor at a college or a boss at a job. But moving from that stage of identity and intimacy, that's really the key point. So some examples, Fangirl, a great book about a girl in college who loves writing fan fiction. She also published a book that is supposed to be the fan fiction that this character wrote. So it's kind of interesting to see that. Marcello in the Real World is about a young man who is on the autism spectrum, and he kind of is trying to grow up and become an adult, even though his parents still sort of see him as a child. 20s Girl is a book by Sophie Kinsella, who writes a lot of books for new adults. And then this book, Soulless, Gail Carringer wrote also some young adult books. So that is basically the continuum, and that's going to be the class. Those are some things that we're going to look at. So I enjoy hearing from you guys, and we will talk about chapter books and the developmental needs of readers at that stage soon. Thanks so much.